All right, here we go for cardiovascular system. So we're going to do an overview of heart anatomy today, some coronary circulation and blood flow. The cardiovascular system consists of the heart and blood vessels, and then the blood, the tissue that actually runs through that. Within our heart and our cardiovascular system, we have two circuits. So we will talk about the pulmonary circuit when we are discussing blood that is going to and from the lungs. And then we have the systemic circuit, which is talking about blood that is going to and from the heart to the rest of the bodies the rest of the body systems in our body. And here we can just take a quick overview. We're going to focus a lot on the heart itself and work through the blood path within. But we can obviously see the numerous vessels that make their way out and about into the periphery to be able to provide oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body. Within the cardiovascular system, there are three main types of blood vessels, really two, arteries and veins, and then we have this third exchange vessel called the capillary. We'll talk more about blood vessels at the end of this unit, but for now, a couple of things to know. Arteries will always, no exception, carry blood away from the heart. So if it's an artery, the blood is leaving or moving away from the heart. Veins are the opposite. They will always return blood to the heart from wherever they are coming from. All right, so we call it the venous return system. And then we have these very, very small, very thin, think tissue paper. Those are called capillaries. And capillaries allow for gas exchange to take place. They allow for nutrients and wastes to move across that barrier and then head into the blood and thus make its way to and from the heart. Our heart is a four-chambered heart, so we have two atria and two ventricles. The atria are the upper receiving chambers. Blood enters into the heart through one of those two atria. And then the ventricles are the pumping chambers. They are below or inferior. They're going to have more cardiac muscle, and they are going to be involved in the movement of blood up and out from the heart tissue itself. There are a couple of terms there that we'll take a look at, but really just orienting yourself to where your heart's located. As an adult, your heart will roughly be about the size of your fist, give or take some vessels. That heart will sit straight on your sternum and then slightly angled with the apex pointing towards your left hip. So the slight majority of your heart will be on the left side. That's why when we pledge, we put our hands over here. But we can see that the heart sits in what's referred to as the mediastinum, or this middle section in between our two lungs. You can see the diaphragm there, but you can also see a little bit of space that is around the heart. And we refer to that as the pericardial cavity. And so let's take a look at this pericardium. Pericardium is the serous membrane layer, double layer too, that surrounds the heart, and it forms a pericardial cavity that fills with pericardial fluid. And that's helpful because you have a muscle that is constantly contracting and relaxing, really doesn't rest for any large periods of time. Therefore, it's going to generate a lot of heat. And so we want to have a fluid present to dissipate that heat and reduce friction. And that's what our pericardium is going to provide for us. So if we take a look here, here is our anterior and posterior side. We can take a look and see our heart. You can see this space that's created there around the heart, and that is the pericardium. We're going to look at it in another view in just a minute here. All right, so we can see that space here created by the pericardial sac. The analogy that's helpful to think about how the pericardium works is if you were to take your fist and push it into a balloon, all right? And what you can see here is there's going to be a part of the balloon that is going to be touching your fist. So if your fist was your heart, that part that is touching, that layer that is touching your hand or your fist would be the visceral pericardium. And that's going to hold on to the heart, serve as kind of an outer layer, outer membrane of the heart tissue itself. But then we're going to have a space in between. That's our pericardial cavity, and that will be filled with pericardial fluid to allow for that friction reduction and heat dissipation. And then you're going to have the layer that is going to be not touching your fist, but on the other side of that cavity, and that's called the parietal pericardium. And that kind of serves as an anchor to the heart to make sure it stays in the mediastinum and it stays in between the two lungs. If you have an inflammation or irritation of that pericardium layer, you could end up with fluid pooling in that pericardial cavity, and we refer to that as cardiac tamponade. And basically what has to happen there is we need to remove that fluid because with too much fluid surrounding your heart tissue, it's not able to do its contraction. And so that weakens the heart and obviously putting it at risk for more serious things to happen, like an MI or something of that nature. The next few slides are going to talk about several of the surface, superficial anatomy, as well as some of that deeper anatomy. I'm going to go ahead and kind of take us through and get to one more piece about the pericardium and myocardium, and then we'll take a look at some heart anatomy. So this is just another view of the pericardium and the pericardial sac, but it also includes the heart tissue itself. So here's that pericardial cavity. So here's that space. And again, we've taken it from this section here, providing us with that parietal and that visceral layer, all right, and that space in between. And then you have this large section here that's consisting of what's called myocardium. Anytime you see the prefix myo, it refers to the heart. So the myocardium is cardiac muscle. This is what does the contracting of the heart itself, right? All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our heart and walk through not only heart anatomy, but our blood flow as well. So we'll do a little 2-for-1. So when we talk about the blood path and how blood makes its way through the heart, that is a process that takes place in only one direction. So we are always only entering and exiting on one-way streets here. So in order to enter the first chamber of the heart, which is called the right atrium, we have one of 3 entrance points. If we are superior to the heart, we come in through the superior vena cava, very large vein right here. If we are located inferior to the heart, we come in through the inferior vena cava here. Or if we are actually a vein coming from the heart itself, all right, so a heart vessel that feeds the heart tissue, we would come in through what's called the coronary sinus, and that's the opening here. But all 3 of those veins are going to release their deoxygenated blood into the right atrium, which is where we are located here. A couple features about atria is that they will have auricles, all right? That's these little like ear-like pieces or beanies that kind of sit on the sides of the atria. And they're also going to have these pectinate muscles. And the pectinate muscles are going to provide extra muscles to be able to do muscle contraction to move any remaining blood once the valve has opened to get out of the atria and down into the ventricles. You'll also notice this little, what used to be an opening here called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a remnant from when you were in utero and you did not have your own heart pumping blood because you were not breathing oxygen from outside. And so your oxygenation was taking place from your mom. Therefore, you didn't need to have ventricles. So all of the blood that was coming into your heart from your mom was just going through this little opening, kind of like a trapdoor, into the left side of your heart so that it could pump to your body instead of going to your lungs because you didn't have any yet. All right, lungs are some of the last organs to develop in babies in utero. Alrighty, so we have entered the right atrium through one of those 3 entrance points. Muscle contraction will take place, and we will go through the first of 4 valves, and this valve is called the tricuspid valve. You'll notice that valves will have a couple of features that are unique to them, these valves down here, and that are atrioventricular valves. And they have these chordae tendineae, that's the strings, all right, your heart strings, so to speak, and they are going to be attached to something called a papillary muscle. And the papillary muscles are going to be receiving electrical stimulus or nervous impulse transmission from the cardiac muscle itself to tell that papillary muscle when to pull on those strings and thus open our valves and close our valves so that we can have blood flowing from the atria to the ventricle. You'll also notice that inside the ventricles, you have this kind of webbing in the walls, and that's called trabeculae carneae. All right, and trabeculae carneae essentially allows for muscle contraction within those ventricles. Again, we don't see that in the atria. So our blood has made its way down into the right ventricle, which is somewhat thinner than our left because our right ventricle only needs to pump blood up and out through the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is structured right here, into the pulmonary trunk, and then it's going to go into one of the 2 sets of pulmonary arteries. Remember, arteries away. And then those pulmonary arteries are going to lead to our right and left lungs, where the red blood cell will receive oxygen and get rid of its carbon dioxide. And then it will make its way back. It'll come back to the left side of the heart through either the left pulmonary veins or the right pulmonary veins, and they will all lead into the left atrium. Remember, atria are receiving chambers. So the left atrium is going to receive from those pulmonary veins oxygenated blood. That oxygenated blood then is going to make its way through the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. Again, another AV valve here with those chordae tendineae and that papillary muscle. And that blood is going to move into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is much thicker than the right. And that is because it needs to be able to create a contraction that's going to push the blood up and out through the aorta and to the rest of the body. So it needs to be able to be strong. And so that's why we need that extra cardiac muscle. We need that thicker left ventricle. That blood is then going to go up and out through the aortic valve, which is hidden beneath here. We'll see it in a different view. And that's going to go up and out through the aorta. And the aorta is broken up into the ascending aorta, the descending aorta, the aortic arch, lots of different segments. And then there will be multiple arteries that will branch off of the aorta to then take that blood to the periphery. One other structure I want to draw your attention to, and that is the interventricular septum, which is located here. And that separates the two ventricles. Much like the atria that have a septum, the ventricles do as well. And that's to make sure we do not mix deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart with oxygenated blood from the left side. Because if we mix them, then we're going to be pumping blood that is not oxygenated to the rest of our body, which isn't going to do us any good. Here's just a couple of more views. These are your heartstrings. All right, there are those chordae tendineae attached to our papillary muscles. Taking a look at our valves, our AV valves, either mitral or tricuspid. And then we can see in an actual heart what you will see when you do your heart dissection. Some of that trabeculae carneae, that interventricular septum. There's a nice clear view of a papillary muscle in your mitral valve. There's a good view of your pulmonary valve here in the pulmonary trunk. So we'll explore that as we do our dissection. All right. Again, make sure that when you talk through your blood path as you are practicing, that you are talking through all of the major features of the heart that you go through. So one more time with feeling. I come in through either the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, or the coronary sinus. I am deoxygenated and I arrive in the right atrium. I move from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then pumps me up and out through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, where I either move to the right or the left pulmonary arteries that take me to the lungs. In the lungs, I become an oxygenated red blood cell, and I make my way back to the heart through either the left or the right pulmonary veins, and they take me into the left atrium. In the left atrium, I will move through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, where, as I can see with my thickened myocardium, I will be pushed by a very large contraction, pushing me up and out through the aortic valve into the aorta, and thus to the rest of the body. Again, comparatively speaking, that left ventricle is going to be much thicker, have much more myocardium than the right ventricle. And again, that's because the left ventricle is part of the systemic circuit, and the right ventricle is part of the pulmonary circuit. The right ventricle only needs to pump blood to the lungs, which are on either side of the heart. The left ventricle has to pump blood through the whole body. So it definitely needs to be thicker and have more muscle cells in order to do that. One important piece to recognize with our valves in our heart, and we're going to take a look at a couple of images here, is that the main purpose of having valves is to prevent regurgitation or backflow. So I only want my blood to flow in one direction because I don't want to mix up my deoxygenated and my oxygenated blood. Therefore, I need to have a mechanism to open and close these valves as my different chambers of my heart contract or relax. So we can see, structurally speaking, our AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, our tricuspid and our bicuspid, operate on the chordae tendineae papillary muscle combination. My semilunar valves, so my pulmonary and my aortic valves, they operate on cusps. So they have these little cusps, I call them like upside down umbrellas, that open and close kind of like saloon doors. All right. So here I can see my aortic valve closed. Let me jump here, and now I can see it open. It's been pushed open. You can see in the diagram there, pushed open like those saloon doors. Blood pumps out, and then they flat back. So I'm just going to go back a slide here, and you can see how these little cusps would then catch some of that blood that was trying to move back into the previous chamber of the heart. All right. So that opening and closing of the valves is going to be extremely important for allowing for that unidirectional or one-directional blood flow. All right, last piece here for today, major piece anyway, is coronary circulation. So our heart is a muscle, meaning it needs oxygen, it needs nutrients, it needs glucose, and it needs to get rid of waste products. So we have several arteries and veins that feed the heart tissue itself. And so you can see several of them labeled here. Obviously in red are our arteries, and in blue are the veins, indicating deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood. We'll go through some of these in more detail as we encounter our coronary artery bypass discussion later on in the month, and we watch our heart surgery, and we talk about blood flow in general. But you can see we have marginal veins, we have, marginal arteries, we have small and great or large cardiac veins here and here. We have something called the circumflex artery. That's one that often gets plaqued up when we are struggling there. And then we have anterior, and we'll see momentarily, posterior interventricular artery. So it runs right along where our interventricular septum is. So it's a good external heart marker to be able to identify structures. One of the most important coronary circulation vessels is this coronary sinus here. This is that return vessel for all of the veins of the heart to get that deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium through that opening of the coronary sinus, and thus back through the heart to the lungs and then out again, which allows, again, for that oxygenation and nutrient delivery to the actual heart muscle itself. When we have blockages in any of these, we call those occlusions. All right, and that is what is referred to as CAD, or coronary artery disease. We'll do a disease opener and discuss that in greater detail. Do make sure that you check through the chapter and the slides that talk about coronary artery disease and MIs, or myocardial infarctions, because as you can see here, when we have blockages to those coronary arteries, that means that oxygen and nutrients are not reaching the heart muscle, meaning the heart muscle is going to start to undergo an ischemic change. It's going to start to die. And when those cells die, we end up with MIs, or myocardial infarctions, more commonly referred to as heart attacks. And obviously that can be very bad for the body, because if the heart doesn't work, then that means that the rest of the body does not receive blood filled with oxygen and nutrients that it needs. So do make sure that you read through that and check out the slides that correspond to that in greater detail. You'll also find some helpful information on bypass, which we will go through in greater detail later on as well.